Welcome to Integrate Health. I'm your host, Dr. Roger Schwelt. I'm board certified in internal medicine, pulmonary diseases, critical care medicine, and sleep medicine. Also the co-founder of medcram.com, an online medical education company. But if you'd like to know more about the links that we're going to share in this talk, highly recommend that you go to sls-tv.com. That's smartlifestyletv.com. So what we're going to talk about today is hydrotherapy and the use of moist heat. And as you can see, this has been done for many, many centuries. In fact, there's a town in the United Kingdom called Bath, and it was where the Romans would take baths because they would use this for their health reasons and for their lives. And there's many ways of doing this. There's contrast showers, saunas, hot fomentations, even spa. There's a lot of different ways of doing this. And we're going to talk about a lot of these today. The first one I wanted to talk about, though, is the sauna. So hydrotherapy, again, comes in contrast showers, baths, saunas, fomentations. And the general prescription or formula that's been handed down traditionally is that there's a long period of heat, as you can see there at the bottom, followed by a short amount of cold. And we'll see that over and over again. Sometimes they'll do something even called mitten friction, where there is a rubbing up and down. For centuries, the Finns would do this when people would go into the sauna. They'd come out and they would hit themselves after they came out with the limbs of trees, branches, to just sort of get the circulation going. And various cultures all do it the same way. And as it turns out, there is a science behind this, and we're going to get into that and some of the evidence. So let's talk about saunas first of all. Sauna, as it's known as, very, very popular in Finland. In fact, that's where most of the data comes from. In fact, as the story goes, there's enough saunas in Finland that if everybody in Finland decided to go into a sauna at the same time, there would be more than enough space for everyone to go in. That's how many there are. In fact, when they do studies in Finland, the control groups are those that do sauna once a week, and the intervention groups are those that do it 3, 4, 5, 6, even up to 7 times per week. So it's a very interesting culture to study and look at. And there's various ways of heating things up. So there's infrared, simple heat, moist heat. Some are more moist, some are more dry. The key temperature that I think a lot of the studies have shown is getting up to something of 174 degrees Fahrenheit and sustaining for about 20 minutes, followed by a cool down and repeating this 2 to 3 times. In Finland, as we talked about, it's very, very common. Skin temperatures at first raise up because that's the outer portion of your body. But the key here is that your core body temperature is heating up. Now, this has a lot of different physiological manifestations in the heart. For instance, cardiac output goes up. It's almost like you're exercising, even though you're sitting down in a sauna and not doing anything. There's an increase in plasma volume, and in sweating, you can actually lose a lot of fluid, so it's really important to drink lots of water. There's also an increase in something called heat shock proteins. Now, this is really important. When you make proteins in your body, they have to be folded in the correct way. And when you become hot, they kind of unfold. And so these heat shock proteins come along and they refold the protein back in the correct way so you can tolerate that better. So people that undergo a lot of sauna have a lot of mechanisms in place and proteins that have been upregulated to be able to tolerate that kind of heat. And so we see that people who do a lot of sauna are able to stay and tolerate heat. But there's immune functionings associated with it, cell signaling, regulation, protein folding, and as we'll talk about, interferon release, which has a lot of immune implications. There's an increase in NRFT2, which regulates the heat shock proteins, transcription. There's a lot of cellular things that happen at a very molecular basis that is very important in terms of cardiovascular, and also, by the way, something called sirtuins, which we'll talk about when we talk about intermittent fasting in another lecture. So sirtuins have been associated with longevity and increased length of life. So does that work? What about IL-6? There's IL-6 from exercise. It increases inflammation, also stimulates IL-10, which reduces inflammation, and there's a complex interplay between those. So let's look at the data. Does sauna use actually improve? Here's a paper that was published in 2019, the blood pressure and the heart rate during sauna bath corresponding to cardiac responses during submaximal dynamic exercise. What they're saying here is that using the sauna, getting your temperature up, in other words, you don't have to use a sauna to get your temperature up, that this is equivalent to exercise. So the acute heat exposure in sauna is a burden comparable to, notice what it says here, moderate physical exercise. We talked about this in our exercise program, that what you need is moderate physical exercise. Imagine doing moderate physical exercise and you're essentially just sitting in the sauna. The sustained decrease in blood pressure after heat exposure suggests that the sauna bath will have a beneficial effect on the cardiovascular system. So notice here, when we look between fatal cardiovascular and all-cause mortality events, those that use sauna once a week was set at a relative risk of 1.0. Those that did it 2 to 3 times per week had a reduction in their all-cause mortality. Those who used it 4 to 7 times per week, there was a significant reduction in relative risk and a 0.63 relative risk for all-cause mortality in these patients. So this is what we're seeing here is a dose-response curve. The more they do something, the more the benefit is. And I think this is extremely powerful evidence that on a regular basis, heating up your body is actually beneficial in terms of another thing. We've got tons of evidence here for the cardiovascular system. Congestive heart failure, there was an improvement. Ischemic heart disease, there was improved vascular endothelial function. We've got the source and the references there at the end. Peripheral artery disease, there was an improvement. Dyslipidemia, there was an improvement. Inflammation, there was an improvement in the cardiovascular system. What about Alzheimer's disease? There was an increase in something called BDNF, that's brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And what they've noticed there is that there was for Alzheimer's disease, there was a 35% relative risk in sauna. So this was a 0.35 relative risk, which means that there was a 65% reduction in Alzheimer's disease in people that use sauna 4 times a week versus just once a week. And that's the source. What about depression? There was acute antidepressant effects and long-term antidepressant effects in depression. You want growth hormone? You want that thing that's secreted at the early portion of the night in slow wave sleep? Well, there was improvements in pain, endurance, and blood flow with increased amount of growth hormone from sauna use. And for those of you who are diabetic with insulin, far infrared saunas reduced fasting glucose levels. And it shouldn't be a surprise if you've watched our light lecture, because we know that near-infrared radiation penetrates deep down into the mitochondria, produces melatonin, cools down those mitochondria, and then you don't get the dysfunctions with the diabetes. So what about physical fitness? Endurance. So my daughter is on the track team in high school, and I've told her, you really need to get into a sauna, because 30 minutes just twice a week increased endurance. So if you're an endurance runner and you want to increase your endurance, sauna is the way to do it, especially on those hot days where you need those heat shock proteins to keep your proteins folded correctly. That's what you need to do. How about when you're getting older and you're losing some muscle mass? How do you prevent that? Daily heat treatments locally prevented muscle atrophy. So again, heat has a way of changing the way your body is actually transcribing material. And I think this is really, really important to understand. What about detoxification? So a lot of times what we try to do is we try to drink lots of water to try to get toxins out of our body. The problem is that if it's not if it's not water soluble, it tends to stick around a lot. And so if you're drinking a lot of water, all right, and you're trying to get that water to flush through your system, there are certain chemicals that will just not dissolve into the blood and go into the urine and come out. However, if you go into a sauna and you start to sweat, there are some chemicals, there are some heavy metals specifically that will be able to be excreted better in the sweat than it would be in the urine. In fact, up to 17 times more soluble in the sweat than it is in the urine. Things like bisphenol A or BPA. Have you heard of BPA? BPB, BPC, all of these bisphenols, they actually can be excreted into the sweat. How about polychlorinated biphenyls? They can also be excreted in the sweat. So it's good to be able to sweat these things out, including phthalates. These are often found in toothpastes, in shampoo, and things that you want to try to avoid. So there may actually be a benefit there in drinking water and sweating it out to allow those toxins to come out. You may have heard of these things and said, is there really truth to it? Well, there actually is truth to detoxification. So in terms of sauna, before we leave that topic, what are some of the things that you ought to know about before you do that? Drink lots of water and make sure you have a lot of electrolytes. You can actually lose quite a bit of water when you sweat. And then pregnant women beware, because there may be some health risks associated with the fetus. So I wouldn't recommend, especially if you're pregnant, going into high heat, because there is some data that it can affect the fetus. And then finally, what about children who are 2 years old plus? So I wouldn't do it less than 2 years of age, because remember that their body surface area to weight ratio is very different, and they can gain and lose a lot of heat very quickly. It's okay if they're more than 2 years of age, but you've got to be very careful about it and watch them very carefully. Certainly you don't want them to do it unsupervised. So we've talked about sauna, and you may be thinking at this point, but saunas are so expensive. Is there any way I can get the benefit of the saunas without having to buy a sauna? Join us as we talk about this more, but before we do that, first I want to introduce my brother Peter Schwelt and my cousin-in-law Aaron Schwelt, and they're going to share with us a little number to make us clear our minds, and when we meet back, we'll dive into a little bit more about this topic. Well, wonderful. Thank you so much. So when we ended off, we were looking at saunas, but saunas are very expensive, but they're a great way to study the effects of heat on the human body. What's an easier way of applying heat that's not as expensive and can be done by just about any? Well, we're going to talk about hydrotherapy, especially in the acute setting, and how it can be helpful. But to do that, we have to understand a little bit more about the cells of the immune system. There are two portions of the immune system. There is the innate immune system over here, which innately recognizes things that are foreign to it, as we talked about in other topics. And then there's the adaptive immune system. This is the part that utilizes proteins that are very specific, and the body makes antibodies against them. This is the part of the immune system that is affected a lot by previous infections or even vaccinations. However, what is the front line portion of the immune system that is going to attack a virus when it comes in? It is the innate immune system. Unfortunately, it gets weaker with age. We've got the natural killer cell, we've got the lymphocyte, we've got the macrophage, all of these sorts of things. So this is the aspect here that we're going to talk about, the aspect on the left, the innate immune system. And the reason why is because it is the innate immune system that specifically secretes something called interferon, or IFN. Interferon is very well named because it interferes with the virus's ability to infect the body. So we learned really early on in terms of COVID-19 that the problem that a lot of people were having, and the reason why they were having so severe symptoms with either SARS or MERS, the original SARS virus back in 2002 and 3 and MERS in 2012, is that the body could not mount an effective early antiviral immune response. They said that this was probably related to type 1 and type 2 interferon responses, which were being delayed. And this was causing moderate disease that were low in patients with severe or critical disease. In other words, if the body was able to make a good interferon response, they would have only a mild disease. But if they were not able to mount an interferon response, they would have severe disease. And this is exactly what they found. This was published in the prestigious journal Science back in 2020 during the pandemic. And notice that if you measure interferon, that when you have a good response of interferon, you get mild disease. But when you have a lower response of interferon, you get critical disease. When they measured interferon activity as well, again, notice mild, good response, critical, low response. They also did some other studies that looked at this. Some patients actually have antibodies against their own interferon. And when they had that, they could not detect any interferon response here, as you can see here in patients with COVID-19. All of these people had very severe COVID, okay? Then you had the ones here that had no antibodies, and you can see here that they actually had a very good response, and those again with antibodies there at the end. These patients here had mutations in their ability to make interferon, and as a result of that, they had a very bad response. And so what they found here, and this is a quote here, said a researcher from the Karolinska Institute, that, quote, together, these two papers explain nearly 14% of severe COVID cases. This is quite amazing, she said. So what more about this interferon? It seems as though interferon is very, very important. Now, we can go back to a study that was published back in 2002 where they took 12 healthy volunteers. They were immersed in a 39.5 Celsius degree hot water bath. That's about 102, 103. And what they observed was very interesting. What they observed is that 3 hours after putting them in hyperthermia, the response of the monocytes, which is part of the innate immune system, to endotoxin was enhanced as expressed by a greater tumor necrosis factor alpha release. They conclude that the thermal effect of fever directly activates monocytes, which increase their ability to respond to bacterial challenge. And also, we can extend that to viral challenges as well. So the point here is that the virus infects and it shuts down interferon, but one way of getting around that is to apply fever and heat to counteract that, to attack the virus or the bacteria. Folks, I don't know if giving Tylenol or antipyretics to people with fevers that are not that high is a good idea. The fever might be the way that the body is actually trying to take care of the situation. Here's a study that looked at something a little different. This was a military study that was done at the University of Toronto, in Canada, and they looked at giving a warm bath followed up by cold at the end. And what they noticed is that that cold at the end seemed to improve natural killer cells and the lytic units that are necessary for those natural killer cells to work. They say here that this study suggests that despite popular beliefs that cold exposure can precipitate a viral infection, the innate component of the immune system is not adversely affected by a brief period of cold exposure. Indeed, the opposite seems to be the case. The fall in core body temperature resulting from cold exposure led to a consistent and statistically significant mobilization of circulating cells and natural killer cell activity. But I love this paper the most, because here we show that when we took lymphocytes out of the human body at various different temperatures Celsius, 37, 37.8, 38 is what represents a fever, 38.5, and then up to 39, which is around 102, 103. Notice what happens to the interferon gamma activity. There is a tenfold increase in the very response that we need to limit the severity of COVID-19. And I think this is very, very intriguing to me in terms of our use of Tylenol, in terms of our use of things to bring down fevers, and what we ought to be doing instead to increase the temperature in these situations. Now, this is nothing new. Dr. Wells Rubel, who was the medical director of the New England Sanitarium during the last pandemic back in 1918, noticed that a lot of people were dying. And it's interesting, at that time, there was a lot of use of aspirin in the Army hospitals because aspirin had just been made available in 1899. And it didn't work very well in the Army hospitals, by the way. In fact, it killed a lot of people. In fact, there was a saying at the time that the German Bayer aspirin killed more servicemen at this time than the German bullets did. And that was saying something. This is what Wells Rubel said in 1919 in Life and Health, May 1st edition. He said, "The present epidemic of influenza has furnished excellent opportunity to test out the efficacy of rational treatment in dealing with respiratory disorders, especially in conditions accompanying and following attacks of influenza." Folks, what was he mentioning when he was talking about rational treatment? Well, he was the medical director of his sanitarium, and they were doing hydrotherapy. They were also doing rest, sunshine, fresh air, but specifically hydrotherapy. This is what he found. He got the information from the Army hospitals. He knew that 16% of those that came down with influenza got pneumonia, and 40% of those went on to die. That's about a 6.4% infection fatality ratio. But over in the sanitariums in the northeast of the United States that were run by the Adventists who were doing hydrotherapy and these sorts of things, what happened was very different. Notice that in the sanitariums there, in 446 patients, only 2% developed pneumonia. Notice 16% here early on and 2% here. They were doing hydrotherapy. They were doing fever treatments, ostensibly increasing interferon. And notice there was such a small amount that went on to develop pneumonia. Now, once they developed pneumonia, of course, the Army hospitals had the latest and the best technology. Those in the sanitariums, they were basically doing outpatient. Notice that once you get to pneumonia in 1918, before the advent of penicillin and antibiotics, you've got about a 50-50 chance of surviving. The key here is to get on it early and get the interferon levels up. And this is nothing new either, because there was a physician by the name of Julius Wagner-Jauregg, who is an Austrian psychiatrist, who noticed in his insane asylums in Austria that when patients with neurosyphilis became febrile, their symptoms actually got better. And so he had an idea. Let's go ahead and infect them with malaria, which is very efficacious at producing fever. Let the malaria cure the neurosyphilis, and then, of course, since they had the cure for malaria, they would just cure them. So he took patients' blood from malaria-infected individuals and put it into people who had neurosyphilis, and he was able to cure them. And for this, he actually got the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1927. Here's a paper reviewing this, published in 2013. What were some of the other ways that you could increase the temperature in people? Notice it says here, immersion of the individual in a hot bath or placing him in a heat cabinet. Wagner-Jauregg's therapy was highly admired and was used on neurosyphilis cases well into the 1950s. That's even after the advent of penicillin, which is now the standard of care for the treatment of neurosyphilis. So, what should you do? how should we take all of this information? I think there are different levels that you can do. So first of all, contrast showers every day. So go into your shower, take a nice hot shower, get that temperature up, allow for that, and then flip the dial over to the cold. And do that for about a minute. What that will do is will cause vasoconstriction in your surface blood vessels and lock that heat in that you've been giving for about 5 to 10 minutes. It will cause demargination of your white blood cells, and it will go and fight this. And you can do this repeated a couple of times for 5 minutes of hot and then 1 minute of cold. If you do this on a daily basis, this is more of a preventative. It's more of a tonic. It's not going to cure any disease. Hopefully, it will prevent it from happening. I think a little bit higher up on the amplitude list would be a hot tub. The highest that you can get a hot tub in the United States is it's set at a maximum of 104. That's probably pretty good. You get in there for about 20 minutes and then jump out and go for a cold plunge. If you're in the wintertime, run outside and sort of wallow around in the snow for a minute and then get back into the hot tub. That type of hot, cold alternating can actually be very beneficial, especially if you're having issues. Now, when you're sick, when you've got COVID, when you've got something else, highly recommend hot fomentations. This is where you heat up towels that you put on your body safely with a layer of towel underneath so you don't burn yourself. And you do the same thing, except you apply it over your body, you put your feet into a hot foot bath, and you're doing the same thing. You're getting the hot body temperature up to 102, 103 if you can, and then you're doing that for about 20 minutes, and then a cool down very quickly, and then resting and allow the body to do that. There's actually some really good information at these two websites. For more information, hydrotherapyathome.com or hydro4covid.com. And by the way, these links will also be on our website that you can look into, which is sls-tv.com. sls-tv.com. If you want more of the links, they will be listed there. Again, for sauna, if you have a sauna, if you're lucky enough to have a sauna, 174 degrees is where the studies have shown benefit. So 174 degrees Fahrenheit for 20 minutes a day. Do it for about 3 times a week. Major health benefits that we've already talked about and reviewed. So this is not something, folks, that is well understood, but let's look at this now. This was the standard of care up until the 1920s when penicillin was discovered. And then it became much easier and much less intensive for nurses and physicians to have these patients do it by giving them a pill. And so we're much able to do it. So now, when we have shortages and supply chain issues, instead of going back 1,000 years and having nothing, let's just go back 100 years and use what we had before we had shortages. So something to consider, look into the research, do your research, talk to your physician before you go into the sauna because there are some contraindications. But I think overall, there's some benefits to be had here. Dr. Roger Schwelt, signing off.